Set your course for the Hoth system.
Going into an asteroid field.
They'd be crazy to follow us, wouldn't they?
We do. The cave is collapsing.
This is no cave.
Just setting a new course. We're going to the Dagobah system. I feel like...
Be like what?
Like we're being watched.
My ally is the Force. And a powerful ally it is. Life creates it. Makes it grow. Its energy surrounds us. Luminous beings are we, not this crude matter.
What is thy bidding, my master?
There is a great disturbance in the Force.
Join me, and I will complete your training. If you only knew the power of the dark side, I am your father.
Hello, everyone. We are very lucky today to be joined by four of the key visual effects artists who are responsible for a lot of the images you just saw. In addition to Empire, they all worked on the first Star Wars film and all contributed to the success of ILM for many, many years. Joe Johnston was credited as visual effects art director, but we all know his contribution was much bigger than that. He was one of the key designers of the Star Wars look. Visual effects director of photography Dennis Muren, whose camera work and creative leadership brought many of the worlds seen in the film to life. The legendary Phil Tippett, whose amazing stop-motion animation work created some of the sweetest eye candy ever produced, and Lorne Peterson, who oversaw the construction of some of the most iconic film miniatures ever built. And I'm Bill George. I'm here because of all the ILM employees. I have the best attendance record. So I want to start off the discussion by going back, not back 40 years, but going back 43 years, and ask you, Joe, what was going on in your life at the when Star Wars came out, and what factors led you to eventually come up to Northern California to work on The Empire Strikes Back?
Well, you know, at the end of Star Wars, George had already said that we were going to do a sequel, and I think. I assume we all felt the same way about it, that we had to do a better film on the second one. We had to plus ourselves because nobody wanted to make a sequel that wasn't as good as the original film. And we knew we probably had less time. We might have had a little bit more money. We had a lot more shots to do, and everything had to be different and new. And so I left Battlestar Galactica fairly early, and once the designs were done, and I came up to Northern California in April of 1978, and started working on just ideas and very rough sketches. George he hadn't finished the script for Empire, and he hadn't really determined what a lot of the action sequences were. So for a long time I just sat around and drew pictures, and that was one of the sort of most creatively fulfilling parts of the job for me, is just to be able to work with George and come up with stuff, basically.
It must have been nice to be so close to him. Before, with ILM being down south and him being up north, it was a disconnect.
Yeah, they gave me an office in one of the houses that was behind where George lived, because I think George bought a couple of houses back there because he didn't want the neighbors to be too close, which is great if you can do it. But it was a 4-bedroom house, and I was the only person in there. So I put a drawing table in the living room, and if I wanted to talk to George, I could walk up to the Parkway house. But it was great being close enough so that I could see him every day if I needed to.
Mm-hmm. So who was the next person to come up? Was it you, Lorne?
I'm not actually sure, but I think I was one of the first ones who came up. Did Richard wasn't on the premises right then. Maybe he came up before me. I don't know. I was still working on Galactica when Joe came up, and George had not really chosen what his team would be, how he was going to have, what crew he was going to have work on it. And I got Richard Edlund came to my desk and said, there's a call upstairs that you need to take. And I said, well, I have a phone down here. Why don't they call me down here? He said, no, Lorne, go upstairs and take a phone call. And it was George, I think George and Gary on a conference call. And they invited me to come up north. And I'm not sure it's exactly then, but it was somewhere along the line they said, it'll be a lot easier as far as the model is concerned because the models are already made. And I kind of bought it, maybe, for a little while.
Sucker.
Yeah, sucker. Yeah.
And then I would imagine, Phil, there was a lot of kind of R&D that went into both the Tauntauns and the Walker. I've seen lots of drawings that you did, that kind of thing. So were you brought on fairly early to start working on that?
Yeah, Joe and John Berg had been working on the Snow Walkers, and I've been pretty close friends with John and met Joe on Star Wars, and so they were working away. John was working away on the prototype, and at some point in time, I don't remember how, but George called and said he had a character that he wanted to design that was like a snow lizard, and asked me if I could do some designs. And so I spent about a day doing a half dozen drawings and sent them up to George, and he picked one and asked me to do a little maquette, and I did one. He said, okay, that's fine. And then at some point when the team was assembled, I think they moved about 12 to 15 people up from LA. That's when I moved back up north.
Did you guys have any challenges convincing people that a technique that is kind of associated with Ray Harryhausen and maybe was a few years old, that was a viable way to do these creatures?
I think Dennis can talk to that, because I think he was, primarily the guy that kind of talked George into doing it as stop motion. Or I think Joe they probably both ganged up on him.
Well, Joe, you look like you're ready to say something.
I was just going to ask the question, how else would you have done it if not stop motion?
A guy in a suit.
The first thing I heard was, and I don't remember who it was, said, well, let's build mechanical miniature walkers that'll actually walk. And I just thought, no way is that ever going to happen. No way will it get done for this show. And because we were, it was tough building anything on Star Wars, and we just really had to struggle to get the stuff finished in time. And with all the shots we had coming up in Empire, to think you could build mechanical walkers couldn't have happened for the budget, and actually working and all. And I just said, no, let's do the stop motion. It'll be fine. I know the team. I know how to put it together, just how to do it. I want to avoid blue screen, get it just as real right through the camera, old school, as we call now. And George had no problem. They had no problem with it. And I think was any artifact from the stop motion of a little jumping here and there makes it look mechanical, which is perfect for the mood and the reality of the show. So there were a few little things like that throughout the show that there's different ways to do it, and you sort of like talk it over and come up with what's the best way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Those decisions always don't often come easy. I seem to remember them thinking they could actually do a running Tauntaun in Norway, full size. Mm-hmm. And that, of course, can't work and all, but they did manage to get a lot of shots with it, with them sitting on it and everything, and all the running shots ended up being done at ILM with Phil doing them.
I thought I saw some drawings that somebody did that looked like it would have been designed around, a guy in an outfit. And I know with some of my original drawings, I drew a outline, a side view of a man, and then drew a Tauntaun over it. And I think I sent it to George, and it said I wrote on it, "Not this." And yeah, so I think they were thinking about a guy in an outfit and then having a dummy Luke on it somehow. And with the walkers, I remember there was some that Joe did some other concept drawings of like wheeled vehicles that were going to be like RC or something like that.
Yeah, they were exploring the whole idea of using tanks. Gary had contacted the Norwegian Army, and they had loaned him a couple of tanks to see if they could dress him up. But that was pretty cliche, I think. Once I saw that U.S. Steel brochure of the truck, the walking truck, I showed it to George and I said, let's do the Imperial, assault force using these. He said, great. I haven't seen that before. So that was the end of the whole tank idea.
We all saw how bad the a guy in a suit, the Wampa suit, turned out in Norway. That was probably that broke the deal right there of having a guy in a suit.
Yeah. Yeah, that was tough.
There were a lot of new people that came in. I mean, I'm assuming there were more people working at the facility, the ILM facility on Empire than on Star Wars. And a lot of people that were hired at that period that stayed with ILM for many, many years. I'm thinking of like Nilo Rodis, Mike Fulmer. How did you guys go about finding people up in Northern California, since it's not really known as kind of a filmmaking area?
Well, I was looking for camera people and went around to all the camera rental houses and just contacted and asked people if there were any people that had been doing effects work that would be interested in and working. I don't think we found anybody that was actually a cameraman that had done effects. There were guys that had done a little bit of work here and there, and they came in and they picked it right up. That whole group. So, and I remember hiring somebody who was living in a houseboat in Green Bay who really loved fantasy and all. I can't remember what happened with them, but it was really neat. They gave them a chance if they had a wide range of interest and some sort of idea they could follow directions, that it wasn't going to be just a bunch of people getting together and having a good time and laughing and stuff like that, but we actually had to work. And if they had the ability to learn something and follow through on it and all, then we'd pretty much give them a chance. But it was tough finding, at least from the camera guy, very, very tough finding folks that had done it.
I remember there were a lot of people that were brought up, mostly camera guys from L.A. I mean, most specialists were imported from L.A.
Yeah.
What about Tom Sanamond? Was he?
Yeah, he was living in L.A. and he was always part of the plan. I mean, John Berg's, as he says, his approach to stop motion armatures is like a blacksmith, and Tom was like a very, very fine artist with his machining skills. And so John was really great at bashing things out and prototyping things, and then Tom came in and refined everything.
Gary had asked me to try not to steal people from L.A., and I tried not to do that. I did steal Bill and Sean Casey, but I sometimes got like 3 and 4 resumes a day, but a lot of them didn't pan out at all. Mm-hmm. And when I interviewed people, I realized that I didn't so much want to see exactly what they did. They had to do good work, but I wanted to see how they worked and how they talked to people, knowing that we would be working a lot of hours and it needed to be pretty compatible people.
Fulmer was a local guy, wasn't he? He was like a really great find.
Yeah, he was a welder from Vacaville or somewhere, Vallejo or something like that.
And he had worked for that big refinery, the company that designed refineries, Bechtel. Yeah, and he'd done a lot of models for Bechtel, but the models he did personally for his own were unbelievable and far and beyond anything you could imagine.
Yeah, I remember, Lorne, you called a bunch of us in, when he came in for his job interview, and he brought a bunch of stuff and knocked everybody out.
Yeah, tiny little hinges on the engine compartment of airplanes, and oh my, he was an incredible model maker, that's for sure.
I bet it was easier to hire for Empire because people knew the success of Star Wars. They kind of knew the idea. It had been sold to everyone.
Yeah. I was invited to a lot of parties, not because they necessarily wanted me, but there'd be like 3 or 4 artists, semi-artists and artists out there that wanted jobs. And it was like a little overwhelming sometimes.
Yeah, I think I interviewed some of those people as artists.
Yeah.
Because, it became obvious fairly early that I was going to need some help. And I always wanted to find an artist who could draw better than I could. Yeah. And I started having these people in with their portfolios, and they were all like, knights on riding dragons and, damsels with swords and everything. I said, no, this is not it. And, Nilo was working for this company, FMC, designing heavy equipment, road graders and earth movers and stuff like that. So I knew that he knew how to draw something and design something that looked like it actually worked. And once, he was great. Once I found Nilo, it was like, stopped searching,
Yeah.
He was telling me he was working for a military prototype, and he was designing toilets and toilet seats so to ensure that when you peed into them, it wouldn't splash back.
Now, I started at ILM in 1981, and I was shocked how small it was. And from what I hear, back when you were doing Empire, you still didn't even have the entire building. There were a couple bays in the back that were like machine shops or auto shops. Yeah. Can you talk about the challenges of what's that?
It was a furniture stripper and a company that folded newspapers also, and a machine shop.
And I heard a story, Phil, about how you did a drawing with a severed finger, and you said, what price, the name of the company?
I made a mold of my finger, and I cast it, and I put it by the bandsaw, because as you entered into the model shop, you had to go through this corridor where a lot of heavy equipment was, and people were walking back and forth, and people were trying to saw things. And so we just I left it there and told a bunch of people and said, Jim Bloom was an associate producer on the show, and he was I think the de facto manager of ILM at the time, and we just kind of waited for Jim to walk by and see the severed finger, and then things changed.
Now, Dennis, you were talking about how your role when you first came on was very much what we would expect a producer to do, going through the shots, seeing which ones can kind of be stacked on top of each other to make it more efficient. And you had a lot of concerns about can the amount of work that we need to do get done in time. And I guess one of the solutions was, did you build more cameras? I know eventually you had to go to night crew so you could use the rare pieces of motion control equipment during the day and at night.
Right, yeah. Well, a night crew's sort of a given. You can always sort of solve things that way. And a lot of the figuring out I did included the night crew, and we were still in disaster zone if we didn't do something. But we ended up building another track camera, and we built 2 other smaller cameras that didn't get ready till the very end of the show. And I think we had a couple of other ones that were old style that we could use, the old Technoramas when we brought it from LA. I think we've had another one also. We did find a few other ones around. But it was just, somebody needed to sort of do that equation. So I went through the script and just estimated how many shots would be in this sequence and that. And if Joe knew, if he'd already been through with George and done some, I'd get an idea from him about how many there were and go through. And just by the time you get to the end, which probably took a few weeks to do that, and you figure about how long each shot's going to take to do, each element of each shot's going to take to do, then you can just back up and you know the deadline and see if you can get those done with the cameras you have to do it. And there was no way we were going to do it at the rate we were going. And I'd gone through both Star Wars and Close Encounters and had situations where the end was just like pandemonium. And there's this final amazing thing that happens in the last 3 months where people just get into another gear. Everything happens. The directors, approve things a little faster maybe because they're out of time. Everybody's out of time and the shows get done. And I just was really worried that would happen on Empire with the difficulty of the work. And I wanted to try to get more time to do it. So based on that, we had sort of a drop dead date for a lot of the gear being ready before we could start shooting. And with everybody working as hard as they could, the gear wasn't ready. But we started with the equipment we had and just kept going. And there was just hardly any time to think. And yet you still had to be able to, make the shots creative and interesting and real. So it was a job that I had done before, the sort of like analyzing things on a couple of other projects. And I thought it was always informative to take the page and turn it into imagery and then into time and work within that constraint. And that's pretty much the real deal.
And of course, optical, that was always kind of they used to call it obstacle, just because it took them so long to get shots through. Was there any thought put into how to speed up that process? Certainly you had some real challenges of ships against a light background as opposed to space, which is fairly forgiving.
Yeah, that was one of the horrific things about the film that was so different from the first Star Wars, is the settings were all different. Most of the stuff in Star Wars was space. Matte lines don't show up as much in front of black backgrounds, but with the snow planet and Cloud City and a lot of other stuff in there, it had to be really, done perfect. So we had a couple of other printers we got in and built to do it. That was mainly stuff that Richard was doing and figuring out, ways to get these film stocks to work better and figuring out just a place to process the film. We ended up sending all the stuff up to Seattle because they had actually a faster turnaround than if we'd gone to LA. So every night the film would go out at 6 o'clock and come back the next morning at 8. So it didn't hurt us or anything like that. So, just tried to solve every problem when it came up, and there was always 5 new ones the next day.
I remember that the turnaround was with the Seattle place necessitated us coming in for dailies in the afternoon, like at 3 o'clock, because the turnaround flying it from Seattle to the Bay Area and landing at SFO and getting it driven up. I remember working till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning a lot of nights.
Huh. I don't remember that. I wonder if that might have been, maybe that's the way it was, but maybe we had a second lab run, possibly. And that would have been for a second run. I don't know. Maybe not.
You remember there was a guy that waited on a motorcycle outside of ILM to go to the airport sometimes with the film. And
Great.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think he rushed back in the morning on a motorcycle.
Hey, Dennis, talking about ships and objects against a a light background. There's someone who I don't think has ever gotten the recognition that he deserves, and that's Mike Pangrazio for painting those snow backings. I mean, that are basically photographic. I mean, that saved you so much time, and not only you, but comping all those elements together. I mean, if we had to do those shots blue screen, I mean, maybe we wouldn't have finished. I don't know, but he painted several of those backings, and they were huge. They were like, 6 by 12 feet, some of them, and he would take a photograph that had been shot in Norway, and he would start in the corner without even sketching it out. He'd start in the corner of his canvas, and he would paint all the way across diagonally without. I mean, it would start as a blank canvas, and then at the end it would be one of these snowscapes. I mean, I've never seen anybody.
And he did them really fast. They were really fast too.
Yeah,
that just amazed me.
Well, one of the things I did when I came up here too is I knew we needed that stuff because that's the way I wanted to do that sequence. So I went around as well as looking for matte painters for people who could paint big backgrounds, and. I don't know if I found him or whatever, but certainly talked to him first. And there were a few people that could do it. It would have been harder for other people. I was prepared to practically simplify everything just to get a nice cloud, blue sky models in there for the hills to avoid having to go to matting on it.
Right.
So it was never going to go to that approach. But Mike just brought it to a level that, was just incredible. And that directing, going in one corner across, every day or whatever, it could be another 4 feet would be painted. And then it's just like, wow, it's unbelievable.
I know. It was really incredible.
That's a whole different way of painting, too. Most people don't paint that way at all.
No.
And he changed. He changed also a couple of years later to working more abstract, starting broad and then filling it in.
I remember when he before you hired him, all we had was some background plates that were shot in Norway with, the VistaVision cameras, and the only thing that could be really done with those was to choose locked off backgrounds, and with the big background murals that Mike did in foreground miniatures, that allowed you, Dennis, to move the camera a lot if you wanted to.
And they also had made some beautiful 4x5 transparencies. That we had to reference from, and that's where Mike got all his references from. They were gorgeous. I don't know what they shot them for. I think a big film crew maybe does that. They just shoot beautiful scenery and bring it back in some form, whether they don't know if it's for projection or reference or for what. But that was a big help. And if you look at those, they'll match. A couple of them match Mike's perfectly. And one of the things I thought of was doing a big photo blow up from those. But the quality's not there, with photochemical on big things. So.
No. That was amazing. Hey, Phil, I wanted to ask you, I watched the film last night for the first time in about 30 years. And were those Scout Walkers blue screen, the 2 shots of the Scout Walker, chicken walker, as we called it, in the walk through the background, those were blue screen, right?
Yeah, because it was such an afterthought. I think it was for stuff that had already been shot. Yeah. And they just glued on.
Right.
I wanted to talk to you, Lorne, a little bit about just the diversity of things that the model shop built on Empire Strikes Back. Most of the things that you did on Star Wars, I guess, were the hard surface, the spaceships. Can you talk a little bit about all the variety of things that you built for Empire?
Yeah, I think one of the first things I remember thinking about was that, yes, it was going to be a lot of snow and what we were going to use for snow. That was the big deal, figuring that one out. And it turns out that industrially, baking soda is made at 3 different sizes for sandblasting purposes. And then we'd used a lot of microballoons on Galactica for a snow planet. I can't remember what it was called, but so we already were familiar with that. So it was depending on what scale we were working at. It was baking soda and then maybe some details in the foreground of microballoons. Mm-hmm. They hated microballoons, too. A lot of people, I remember Phil had a reaction to the edges of his eyes sometimes, irritated his eyes.
They were microscopic pieces of glass.
Exactly. They're spheres. 26 microns is what the size of them. And I think it takes 10,000 microns to make an inch, something like that.
Yeah, but you can still crush them and turn them into sharp things.
Yeah.
Didn't we have to wear, respirators when we were working with that stuff?
At times, but we didn't always. And it didn't bother everybody the same. And,
I think OSHA would have something to say about that, wouldn't they?
Yes, they would. Yeah. Yeah, some people, some people were bothered by one chemical and not by another, and and vice versa, that kind of thing. So, but that started us on a path of doing. I wasn't coined the word, but bigatures. That instead of being desktop models, eventually that was taken over by CG, of course. But we started doing environmental models, and so that meant finding all kinds of unusual materials, like corncob fractions, which was some weird stuff that was old corn cobs that were ground up to a fine powder, or walnut shells. All that kind of stuff were materials that scaled good for sand coming back from the desert. They'd send me samples, and I'd measure the sand and then try to find some material that would scale down.
One of the images I love, Dennis, is seeing Phil and John Berg animating the walkers, and they've got these little trap doors that come up in the set. And I would imagine that it would take a lot of planning to figure out, like, where's the animator going to be, where's the camera going to be. Was that something that you took the lead on, like doing plans, figuring out exactly what's what, or was it just a set and you just placed the camera?
I don't know. I mean, it had been done. I'd heard about it on the old Hansel and Gretel film that had been done in the 50s, stop motion. I'm sure everybody knew about it and had been done before, probably. But the way to do it is figure the shot out and then let the animators get in and sort of pick the places, So that's the best way, and that it's as small as it can be to prevent them from hitting their elbows with it and shaking everything, but yet still comfortable.
So then, Lorne, would that be something you'd make the trapdoors?
The stage guys made the platforms, and we just said make the trapdoor here and there. It was a bit of a trick making it so that it was pretty much invisible. It was still a white trapdoor, a white piece of plastic. Right. I was going to say I remember putting with a stick and pushing sandwiches underneath of that sets to Phil Tippett and John Berg. They didn't want to be talked to, but we would slip sandwiches and drinks underneath the table to them.
Keep working.
Yeah, keep working. Don't break our concentration.
Once you started a shot, you just didn't want to stop.
That whole thing was pretty amazing, though, because stop motion had been done for so long, and we were all big fans of it. And then, it was an opportunity to upgrade it. And we had one of the first frame grabbers, so you could actually compare it to the previous frame. So you could go and see if you forgot something or made a mistake, you could maybe catch it in time, And the idea with, I had like a week or two to work on the lighting to try to make it look more sun-like than you'd seen before, and big bounce cards surrounding the entire set with bounce cards, which is something I'd seen done for commercials and lighting women's hair to make them look like glossy and just glowing. In this case, just to represent skylight, and then everything being different colors and all, and then all the precision that went in on the armature that Phil and John and Tom put into designing it, that didn't have any, that I know of, any big jumps. If you grabbed it, it just moved smoothly to where you wanted to. All that, it was really tricked out to the period as being like just the slickest and the best, and we had the time to do it, and we had the money to do it, and the will to do it, and that's one of the reasons it came out the way it did, I think.
Before I started working on Star Wars, before I got hired, I go out and visit Dennis and Ken Ralston, who were working on the night crew. And that's where, I became aware of the motion control equipment. And, throughout the history of stop motion, stop motion guys have been trying to figure out ways of adding motion blur to stop motion. And none were really that successful, and they were very laborious. And So it became very clear, I think, to all of us all at the same time that if we could hook up a stop-motion puppet to the motion control equipment and, shoot that with a stop motion with an effectively 180-degree shutter and get a motion blur, then it would definitely add something. And that's what we did with the Tauntaun, worked it out. It turned out to be like kind of complicated in terms of the setups Dennis had to do, but it was only one axis of movement at the time, but it really helped integrate things a little bit better.
One of the interesting things about Star Wars, the original dice reflex also, is that is a continuous motion motor control with the shutter and opens and closes and everything like that. And that was all set up that the shutter was going to be open for half the motion, then closed for the other half of the motion, which duplicates a movie camera. So you'd think, well, yeah, that's the way to do it, of course, and that's what Phil's talking about. But some of the people that copied the dice reflex didn't like that. And the camera would move to its spot, then open the shutter, close the shutter, and move to the next spot, and open the shutter, and they just missed all the blurs. And it's like, what's going on here? We're making movies. Doesn't anybody know how movies made and the artifacts that you want and the reality? And to their mind, it was improving something. It didn't. You got a sharper picture like that. But we were all film fans, and we knew that all that, that little stuff that seems little can make a big difference in the middle of a film, and gets you gives you an example of something that is correct that you can aim for, not that you're going to discover later was incorrect.
Well, it's interesting too, Dennis, to hear you talking about little bits and pieces from earlier projects that kind of came together. That experience of seeing the commercial where they're lighting a woman's hair and that going into your head, and then you pull it out. You never know what is going to lead to the success of a shot. And I think that's one thing the early ILM was so amazing, that they were just these amazing people that had such a great depth of experience. You never knew where the solution was going to come from.
Right, yeah. It was the spirit of the 60s, and it really was. Experimenting and all, but also, learning and being curious, and keeping all that stuff, in your mind. One of the things I realize in dealing with all terrific directors, they have got tremendous memories of films they've seen. They've studied the films they've seen. They often don't talk about it, but that's where they're pulling ideas from. And, whereas I'll look at something and see a technical thing here or a performance thing there I like, or a design that I think could have been better if it had been over here or something. Directors will see an emotional sequence lasting 2 minutes long and think about how the arc ramped up and went down, and they studied, the construction of that and the dialogue of it, some have. And they grabbed from that, and I think studying the past is so important. If you're, in the present, to either take it or discard it, but to see to see how it's been done, and then as a starting point of her judging your own work. Do you want to stay there and do that all your life? Fine. Do you want to try to go farther up somewhere else? Fine. That's going to be a little harder, but that's always what I want to do. So I just always try to go somewhere that I haven't been before. That's going to be noticeable on the images.
Yeah, and that's where I think art and film, history education really comes in handy, particularly working with DPs and directors, because they're all really well, educated about stuff, and can say whatever, Rembrandt lighting or David Hockney lighting or a Kubrick shot, for a certain thing, or a John Ford shot. And it cuts through it really quickly. I mean, everybody knows that shorthand and that language and can move on. You don't have to write a dissertation about, what you want to do. You just build on, the best stuff that's been done before.
When I first came up in April of '78, George had the film Alexander Nevsky on a Betamax tape, and by Eisenstein's film. And this is sort of to your point, Dennis. And he had it queued up to the ice, to the battle on the ice, I think it's called, which I think is fairly near it's near the beginning of the film. But we watched it, and he said, "I want the the beginning of the battle on Hoth to feel like this. I don't want it to look like this. I want it to feel like this. You know? So, and nothing had been done. I mean, I don't think he even had the sequence scripted yet. But I was thinking, well, this gives me a lot of, flexibility. I can do pretty much anything I want, and we'll see what happens. So I decided that whatever the Empire had, whether it was tanks or walkers or whatever, I was going to have them come from the right, and the rebels be on the left. And I have this I had heard about this rule of thumb where the good guys always come from the right, and the bad guys are always on the left. And I said, well, I'm gonna switch it, just to see how that feels. And I'm thinking, okay, when they get to Norway, the DP could look at the direction they have to shoot, and he could say, well, the lighting would be better if we shot this way, and it could have all gotten reversed, but it didn't. And at that point, George, since he hadn't even started the sequence, I felt like I'm going to do what I can and see and just keep going until he shoots something down, And I had like 5 or 6 months before ILM really got going, so I had a lot of time to just sort of play around with stuff. It was really great, really a lot of fun. Yeah.
So Joe, when you were doing these designs, which were revolutionary at the time, what was your thought process? Did you just kind of zone out and just do stuff that looked cool? Did you have a philosophy of what the Rebel stuff would be like, what the Imperial stuff would be like?
I knew what I wanted the Rebel stuff and the Imperial stuff to look like, because there were a lot of designers working on this stuff, designers and artists. Ralph was doing stuff, and Norman Reynolds was doing some stuff in England, and when Nilo started, he was doing stuff, and they were all doing designs, and there was some really cool stuff. But I wanted to make sure that I was sort of the last process that all these designs went through, because I had an idea of what I wanted the stuff to look like. So, I made sure that the final design, whether it had come from, somebody else or not, was that I was able to influence it and keep it, this stuff is the Rebel stuff, this is the Imperial stuff. And in the case of Boba Fett, he's neither. He's a bounty hunter. So, Nilo designed that ship, Slave One, and I let him, and it's basically exactly as Nilo designed it, because it didn't fall into either category. So I thought, here's an opportunity to have a ship that's from some other total different universe,
Did he base that thing off of a hairdryer?
It was either a hairdryer or a
street lamp.
It was a street lamp, and Marin County still has some of those street lamps every once in a while next to the freeway. And I've wondered how long. Yeah, how could I get one?
Yeah, but George would want to see like 10 sketches, and he'd pick one or two and say go off in this direction. So George was monitoring all that stuff.
Of course.
I mean, nothing got on the screen that George didn't think was right. So
I didn't know this. I'd heard that all the sound effects for R2-D2, that George would sit down with Ben, or Ben had a tape recorder, and George would do all the little beeps and goops by himself. And because each one has got an expression, right? You can be beep, 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 which will be kind of funny, which will be sad. He did those.
Wow.
Which is the acting. And then George would take, or Ben would take those in and make them electronic and probably embellish them, But that's people don't know that show and so many of these terrific shows really are going through filtered through a mind that is making decisions that are consistent with an overall feel. Not that it has to be 100%, but the roots are there, the structure is there, and if something fits or it doesn't fit. And he needed actors for the two robots, and he became, or at least for R2, he became the actor for that with the voices choices he came up with.
I hadn't heard that, but it makes sense.
Hey, Bill, we got to talk about two sequences. We got to talk about the asteroid sequence and we got to talk about the Falcon as the Star Destroyers were coming together and diving down and escaping. And with Joe, I mean, the design of those sequences is so important that I think it's really interesting to talk about those two as well. I mean, there's a lot of others, but those are ones that have always stood out to me as being ones that could have gone south very quickly.
Well, to start, I want to say that the asteroid sequence, the asteroid field, as it's called on the CD, is my favorite piece of music in any of the three films. It's fantastic, and it fits that sequence so perfectly. But I mean, asteroid sequence. I just remember me and Mike Pangrazio on the floor, spattering acetone on giant pieces of foam, to pit them and everything, and then painting them brown. I mean, it was, I had a headache for days after that.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was I don't know. I'll let you guys weigh in. I was just blown away by the music.
Well, the scene was so dynamic the way it was designed. And then Ken Ralston was primarily responsible for doing a lot of the programming of all the ships and the rocks and everything. And he was just the perfect choice because he comes from an animation background, and so everything is moving kinetically with animator's sense of pace and timing, and that really helped the scene.
Mm.
And you guys built a smaller Falcon that was more maneuverable too, right? It was like about a 3-foot one.
2 foot.
So
yeah, we built a
big
3-foot Falcon for that.
3-foot one, and then we built a 2-foot one. I mean, the original one weighed a ton, and it would take a couple of people, 4 people, to lift it. So if we'd used that to do this, the shots would have had been shot very, very slowly, so it wouldn't wobble on the stand. So they made a light aluminum one at 2 feet.
Right. That just made it much more flexible and all, and it does maneuvers in the film that are sort of inconsistent with the Falcon. You never see the actors like spinning around or anything like that. But when we got into the show, and especially into that sequence, it just seemed like something to get away from the straight flying would help. And if it could do a flip to get over here, and George said, "Sure, fine, go ahead." And it really helped the sequence and everything with the ship. Occasionally to have it do maneuvers that are more fun and more interesting to do. But I remember when we started the asteroid sequence, though, you couldn't tell what you were looking at. The original idea was asteroids are coming from every direction and the ship's flying through and evading them. You couldn't tell what the heck you were looking at. As soon as your eye was on the ship, another big asteroid came in over here, and then the one that was supposed to hit the ship came this way, and you weren't looking there, and you couldn't figure out why the maneuver was going on. So, Joe, I remember we went through and redesigned those shots so that and the storyboard form, as I remember at least, so there was a single direction most of the time, not all the time, for the asteroids and still look dangerous, so that you could at least know where to look to see why the Falcon, why it's in danger, what almost happened, and how it evaded it. And that was something we weren't expecting and really helped the sequence. But maybe you don't remember that. But anyway.
Well, I remember that it would have been nice to be able to do an animatic of it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Right.
But that was sort of pre-animatic days for us. That came with Jedi.
Right. Yeah.
When Ken was shooting a lot of the asteroids, I mean, there were just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of asteroid elements that they shot for weeks and weeks, and they got really bored doing it. It was like really tedious stuff, and so they would entertain themselves they'd just put a potato in for an asteroid or a tennis shoe or whatever, and see if they could get away with it. So those are things that are floating around out there someplace in deep space.
Yeah. The model shop lucked out on that with the Millennium Falcon, and that the model kits that we used to bash came in both 24 scale and 12 scale. So when we made the smaller Falcon, all of a sudden we had the same parts that we could use. We didn't plan it that way. We just really lucked out.
Joe, you were mentioning earlier kind of a design philosophy of the Falcon about it being round and in thirds. Could you talk about that a little? Because I know there's a lot of Falcon fans out there.
Yeah, well, the reason the Falcon came about was because of Space 1999, as you know, and the Eagle was this called the Eagle? Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's that ship, and so George and Grant had already built the cockpit and the radar dish. So George said, we got to have a new ship for Han Solo, which was originally called the pirate ship. We got to have a new pirate ship for Han Solo. And so, I said, well, what do you want it to look like? He said, I want it to look as much unlike that as possible. So, and Grant said, do me a favor, let me use the cockpit and the radar dish, because they'd already built those. So I went home that night and I did about 6 or 8 sketches of a spaceship, and they were all based on sort of a flying saucer, because I figured that's as far from what we had as you could get. And some of them had the cockpit out front, and some of them had the cockpit up where the gun ended up. But they were all sort of, generally the same shape. And I showed George the next morning, and he said, I like that one. And it was the one where the cockpit was off on the side. And so I never had time to do sketches of the Millennium Falcon, because we started building it that day. Wow. So there weren't a lot of design sketches done, just very few. But one of the things that I asked Grant if he could do, I said, how about if the cockpit, is static, and when they do maneuvering, the ship goes around the cockpit, but the pilot doesn't have to bank. He stays, at 0 degrees horizontal. And Grant said, we can't do that. He said, forget it. We're not going to do that. I said, okay, it's going to make the cockpit scenes in live action really, He says, they'll bank the camera. Don't worry about it. So anyway, I lost that one.
But we got it on the B-wing.
Yeah, I got it on the B-wing. Anyway, I forgot what your question was. I rambled.
Just the design philosophy. You said something about circles in the thirds.
Yeah, I wanted it to be, have a sort of a circle theme. So the whole thing is a circle. It's got circles on the side. It's got circles on the top. The radar dish is a circle. The cockpit's a circle. And I started measuring things like some shapes are a third the distance of others, and the whole thing. And the gun port is I think is 1/6 of the total shape, total distance. So I just wanted it to have a, to feel like it had a theme. And when that's why I think they ought to put the original radar dish back on the Millennium Falcon for whatever the next sequel is, because that rectangular dish doesn't do it. It's just wrong. Talk to those guys, will you?
Somebody wanted to know, do you guys remember when Walter Cronkite visited Kerner and interviewed George Lucas?
Yeah, I remember him being there. I didn't, they sort of whisked him through, and then he and George went off somewhere and did the interview. But there's photographic evidence of him being there, for sure.
I think they had like 4 set up somewhere around the building, and he got escorted each one, and they were all pre-lit, and the cameras were there and everything. Something like it was more than that.
His assistant asked him, "Are you doing okay, Walter?" And he said, "Yes, but I can't hold my stomach in much longer."
Right.
He came and visited the Tauntaun set, and Ken Ralston was kind of upset that he didn't get to, get a picture with Walter Cronkite, because he wanted his mom to see him with Walter Cronkite. So we faked the Tauntaun scene, and I had just animated all those scenes by myself, but there's some pictures in magazines and whatnot of Ken and I both animating the Tauntaun for publicity for Walter Cronkite.
Yeah.
So his mom got to see him with Walt. Well, I guess Walt.
Right.
You know, one of the stories I love to tell from Empire, of course, I wasn't there, but I heard about it when people are talking about schedules and we're never going to make the end. And I said, well, you know, on Empire Strikes Back, the movie was in theaters and they were still building a model that was built, shot, composited into a shot, and then sent out and put into the films. And I'm assuming that's a true story?
Yeah, 2 weeks before the release, George had us do a shot of Han Solo riding on the Tauntaun in the ice, and it was a very wide shot, but it ended up getting cut in the film. But that was 2 weeks before the release, and they were already making the prints. And I'd ask him, God, aren't you worried about that? And he goes like, no, practically every movie I've worked on, the print is still wet when it's delivered to the theaters, and the projectionist ends up having to get a hairdryer, and as it's coming off of the reel, they would have to dry it with a hairdryer.
It was the hospital chip that was added. Originally, the test audience couldn't figure out where the Millennium Falcon with Lando Calrissian was in it when Luke and Leia were on that hospital bed, when he lost his hand. So they needed to make it a bigger model and using, I think, the 2-foot Millennium Falcon rather than the 6-inch Millennium Falcon. That was the reason for it.
So it's the shot that starts tight on the Falcon and then it kind of zips over and shows the empty bay. So
and I think, didn't you, Dennis, do a little rear projection of Luke and Leia in the backside of that model? Yeah, I think.
Yeah, that's how we did it. But the film was not out, I don't think, by the time he did that, was it? I don't think it was added after the release. It was added after a preview. Is that right? But I'd heard that there were a number of prints that went out with temp shots in them. 70 millimeter prints, 15 or 20 or 30 temps in it. And I don't know how many prints. They said, it's not very many, 20 or something like that. But don't worry, we're going to pull them all back. And they all went to not to the coasts, went to the Midwest. And I don't know whatever happened, if they're still there, but we redid them or finished them, but they just didn't make that first run of 70 millimeter prints, which took a lot longer to make than the 35 millimeter prints. So.
I mean, I saw the film at a industry preview, and then I saw it with a regular audience, and the two prints were different because the first one I saw was the 35 millimeter, and the second was the 70. Oh. And the shot at the end where they come to rescue Luke hanging underneath the Cloud City, I remember the big dish antenna coming up in the 35 millimeter print, and it wasn't there in the 70.
Oh yeah, there's probably one of them, and there's 20 other ones too.
Right, because they had to get the negative to make the 70 prints. It took so long.
Yeah. And they even had it down to which reels were going first. You could tell them, wait, it looks like we need reel 7 has to hold, reel 3 has to hold, do the other reels first. And if all went well, they would at least give them more time by printing them in that order. And so it would give us another, 12 hours of the lab or our time to be able to get it and then get the negative down there. So.
And different people in the company were hired to be print watchers. And so they would, there would be one guy, I think Howie Stein, one of the editors, was stuck with reel 4, and he had to watch whatever the release, amount was, 4,000 prints of number 4 to make sure that there were no color correction mistakes.
Well, any other memories you guys have of that time?
If you look at the crew picture at the end of the thing, there's about 60 people on that crew, which is a remarkably small amount of people for all of that work. It's really pretty stunning.
There must have been more than that, but some people didn't make it all the way to the end.
It's a good thing we didn't know what we were doing.
Right. That's where the best work comes from.
Yeah. And the optimism of youth is what we had.
Well, Dennis, you were talking about that other sequence. What is it about that sequence that it is memorable to you?
Yeah, you mean the Star Destroyers, right? I remember, and I talked to, Jonathan Rinsler, I mentioned that sequence to him, and he said, that's one of my favorite sequences. I'm saying, what is it? And what it is it's hard to figure out what the heck's going on. You can see it, you understand it, but the shot design was really hard, is my memory of it, coming up with the angles to see the Falcon is being approached by a Star Destroyer, and maybe there's a couple other Star Destroyers somewhere, but you're not sure. And like, what are we going to do? Evasive maneuver, and he dives straight down, and the remaining three then are going to collide with each other as this other ship is dropping down, followed by two TIE ships shooting at him. So your view is going from here to here, and then to like this, and it's just, it could have just been, I don't have no idea what's going on. And I think it came out, I just remember spending a lot of time in the shot design on that with you, coming up with the views on it. There was something at the beginning, but everything needed some refinement here and there. So that when you're looking up, I remember I pretended in my own mind like the Falcon was falling, like a leaf or something out of control airplane, so it was like spinning around, so you got a sense of looking up, and rotating the Star Destroyer, so the shadows change on them, so you can see one is trying to make an evasive maneuver, because there's like three triangles. And how are you going to know anyone's, they're not just cutouts, but you could get the shadows to change. And it was like 4 or 5 shots in a row that were really, really difficult. But what a funny idea. Another great idea for all this. And did you ever talk about the Falcon just flying off in some other direction, or where did that whole idea come from? Do you remember?
It must have come from George, the idea of him diving down. But like I said, I watched the movie last night, and when that sequence came on, at the end of it, I'm thinking, boy, those Star Destroyer drivers are really bad. They're in these gigantic ships, and they're going to collide head on in space. Come on.
Well, but the thing is, they're all focused on getting the Falcon. That's all they see is the Falcon. So there's and they're not the brightest guy. The Army's been around for a while. The promotions from the bottom on up.
Right. Well, Vader had already killed everybody who was disloyal to him. So, it's like a fourth string at the wheel.
Like our president.
They hadn't invented backup cameras for cars even then, so they couldn't see what was behind them or anything like that. Probably sideways either.
Right.
When somewhere along the line, George wanted to have a very distinctive ship for Darth, and it would to be painted the same as the TIE fighters, and of course production wanted to save money, so they told the model shop, well, how about you just paint the white Star Destroyer blue-gray, and then we could paint it back to white after they'd done those shots, without ever thinking that we would have thousands and thousands of fiber optics that would have to be scratched, to get the light back again, and just it would be just impossible. And then I know Joe and George came up with a whole new design for Darth's ship, which was fortunate, because then they stopped trying to make us repaint it.
Yeah, but the whole idea is that it's 15 times bigger than a standard Star Destroyer. That was the thing. You wanted the scale to be so different that, it looked like sort of a floating city almost.
Yeah. And it was.
Yeah.
We should talk too about the work that went into building all this equipment that had to get done for the show, or to get it done. The additional 80-foot track camera. I think we had it for that show. Maybe that didn't come till the next one. So we had a whole electronics department, optical lens design, machinists, draftsmen, all just to build the gear that was going to, and the cameras, building 2 new cameras, the gear necessary to get it done. And that stuff is invisible on the screen. You can't look at it and say, oh, I like this and I like that. But it's the stuff that gave you the imagery of it, and there was great people working on those for that tough 2 years, and that continued on at ILM for years and decades, building stuff like that,
Where we built all the stop motion puppets, the room was next to those guys, the guys that were involved with engineering all that stuff, and they were a really interesting group of people. They were like cowboys and hippies, and Jerry Jeffries was, or Jeffers was the lead guy, and he was like the Slim Pickens kind of guy, and they were a wacky group of people.
One of the machinists. Oh, go ahead, Joe.
I was just going to say, isn't that the guys who, when the French documentary crew was there, Jerry Jeffers dropped the Empire Flex camera on the ground?
I remember that. Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah.
And it's in the documentary.
And the camera pans down to look at it.
Yeah.
One of those machinists, Jim Beaumont. One morning I came in and he had this perfect white feather on his mill, and I asked him about it, or I think I did, and he said, every morning I try to find something that's just perfect in nature, and inspire me for making camera parts, for making the movement inside of a camera. It was, and I one time saw him had a beautiful dried leaf on his machinist, on his mill in the morning. So he had a certain mystical quality about him, about what he was doing.
He would hand lap the pull down movements, and he would do incantations. He didn't do any of that on a mill or anything. He just did it all by hand.
Wasn't there a model shop guy who lost his apartment and he lived in the model shop for a while, Lorne? Sam Zoltais?
Yeah. That was Sam Zoltais. Phil had mentioned him earlier. He had worked for Kohler bathroom fixtures, and he was there to do the graphite work on the Empire camera. But his girlfriend had kicked him out of the house, or the end of the relationship, and he just moved in above near the water heater, back behind Phil's place, and he put up black duvetine and had a bed. And one of the janitors came to me at nighttime and said, do you know that somebody's in your model shop is sleeping here? And he would go away and eat dinner after we all left. I guess he'd go out to a restaurant, and then he'd come back and sleep. Wake up in the morning, we had a shower. He'd get a shower real early. And I never did find out how long he lived there, but we had to tell him that he couldn't do that. But that was Sam Zoltais.
I know they located him recently. Someone did.
Yeah. Yes. He lives in the foothills of the Sierras or something like that. He has a big sign that says, "We'll shoot on site. Don't approach my property," something like that. Yeah. Do you remember that when we first got there, the building, it was empty except in the front. And I don't know who had the idea, but they asked the carpenters to deliver a whole bunch of 2x4s, 12 foot, 18 foot, 6 foot. And we laid out the walls of where the different departments were going to be, and rather than doing drawings. And I thought that was just a brilliant idea, because but the one thing that happened was electronics wasn't represented. Larry Meyer hadn't been hired yet. And so his department kept getting smaller and narrower as people kept moving the 2x4s about where their room would be, And so he got this very long, narrow room. But it was a great idea, whoever had it.
I remember when I first went to the building, the Kerner building, you could walk where the two bathrooms were. Mm-hmm. You could open that door, and it was just one gigantic open space. Yeah. And Jim Bloom had come by to let me in the building just to look at it, and I had to paint the Boba Fett outfit. I needed a space to lay everything on the ground. And he's looking at the building. He says, "We'll never fill this up." And within like 6 weeks, we had a second level in there already. You remember that, Dennis?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was great. Phil and I flew up. Phil and I flew up on an early trip, and they showed us the same thing, walking into the empty building and all, and it was daunting and so exciting that here was where we're going to be able to start on the sequel to Star Wars in this space. And, we're in San Francisco, and we get to driving over the Golden Gate Bridge and in Marin County, and it was just like paradise, you know.
Yeah,
it really
with this
was.
stress level that was coming, you know. It was great. And I think at the time, you know, we had like 2 years almost at that time. We came up just about 2 years. And I think it didn't seem like it was going to be that tough a show until we saw the script. And then that's when it just hit me and maybe everybody else that this is not like we're going to use the models again or anything like that. This is all new, and you got to really get going.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we could use the X-Wings, the Y-Wings, and some of the TIE fighters, but other than that, it was all new stuff.
Right.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm just we should talk about, you know, the great optical department. Bruce Nicholson, you know, headed up the optical department. They worked on the first show and also worked on Close Encounters. And, you know, they brought a lot of people from LA up for that. It was just, you know, amazing guys working. That was another 24-hour-a-day department. And then an animation department also going on that was doing all the lasers and all this other handwork that needed to be done and rotoscope and mats and everything. And I'm sure there's other ones in there. You know, there was the wood shop and the model shop, and there was paint people and everything, construction.
Yeah.
But
guys,
optical, you know, seemed like alchemists. Like they were into the black arts, you know, and it was just like all the hoops that they had to go through and all their little tricks. And I think it was pretty much, you know, Bruce Nicholson that, you know, did a lot of the heavy lifting. That, you know, was the key to making that whole department work.
There were a lot of stage guys that came from like the opera as well. Ted Menke.
Yeah.
Ted.
Dickie
we had a lot of guys that you know, that were from the local 16 up here who'd worked at the opera houses and the theaters, and also worked on movies that had been made in the Bay Area. You know, worked on Dirty Harry and a lot of films that were made. They'd, you know, get like, you know, 6 or 8 weeks work there, and then go back to theater or you know, magician show down there, or the opera. So they had some film experience, and they became, you know, we had a group of probably about 6 or 8 of them that worked at ILM for a couple of decades that were just great. We had, you know, Ted Menke, and we had Dickie Dova, whose dad jumped off of the Hindenburg and survived, you know.
Yep.
And was a champion ice skater.
Yeah. Dickie was a skater, and Ted Menke were ice skaters, and the Ice Capades or Ice Follies, one of those things. Whole different type of people than LA, where everybody it's just business LA.
Yeah.
You know, Ted worked on THX 1138.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So he must have been George's first employee.
I remember, you know, really early on, you know, Ted was the old guy. I mean, most of us were in our, you know, early to mid 20s, you know, and he was like, what, 35 or 40? So he was like the old guy. And I don't know what happened, but I crossed him somehow. And we got into like this huge screaming match that just went on and on and on. People tried to break us up, and at one point one of us yelled at the other and goes like, "What are we screaming about?" And the other one went like, "I don't know." And we were great buddies after that. And I ran out and bought him a bottle of whiskey, and then everything was fine.
Yeah.
I can imagine you yelling like that. I can't imagine Ted.
Oh, yeah, he's got a loud voice.
I know he does, but I've never seen him mad.
Yeah.
I was worried.
We had one thing. So for the asteroid sequence, we had to come up with some way to do a lot of asteroids, you know, like hundreds of them for an element. And how do you do that? They should all be moving and all. So we gave Ted this assignment of making the asteroid mover, which was a series of wires with little clay asteroids in them. The wires painted black, a whole bunch of them in different angles, like probably about 30 or 40 of them with little asteroids on them. And he put a little chain around it, and you would crank the little chain, and they would all be rotating separately. And that's in the back. That's in almost every shot, is that little asteroid. And we have a name for it, asteroid mover or something like that.
I don't think it still exists. I'm not sure it still exists. I wish it did.
You should motorize it. It should always be there motorized. Always moving. Yeah.
Yeah, they rotated it.
Ted, there's a guy, an ice skater with a background way more than film industry could bring that to it. Bring that mechanical construction thing, figuring out how to do this when you got this difficult problem, and he may have figured it all out himself, how to do it. I can't remember.
Yeah, the model shop didn't have anything to do with that little box, so it was probably just all Ted.
Yeah, probably so. And then, Lorne, you had a lot of great model movers or model makers working with you too.
Yeah, I really lucked out.
Yeah,
really lucked out. I felt more like just their peer rather than the head of the department. Sometimes, they. I remember Bill one time, as a fairly new employee, and I was trying to show him something about an armature for something, and he kind of held up his hand and said, "Lorne, I can do it. I can do it myself." It was like a lot of people didn't need anything other than just the very germ at the beginning of the idea, and they'd run with it. So I had to modify my behavior after a while, that it wasn't necessary for me to be involved in everything.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it was easier after you guys had kind of established the methodology and the look.
Yeah.
I would imagine, you guys took Empire so much further than Star Wars as far as the artistry, the shot design, execution, all that. But you didn't have to explain to people what you were doing. We all understood because we had seen the first or second film.
Yeah. Or you understood.
And we had to make so many more different things for the show, too. We needed a Star Destroyer twice as big, 8 feet, because we had to get so close to it for that shot of the Falcon on the back of it, and for some other shots too. And then we had to get that half-size Falcon because the stage wasn't big enough to ever get the 6-footer to go far enough in the distance. It really limited how small it could get in the screen.
And Mike Fulmer made a perfect little, like $half size Falcon, right? That got stuck on the back of that thing.
Yeah.
It was amazing.
The back, but even bigger one, yeah.
That big.
We had a 6-inch one stuck on the back and a 2-foot one stuck on the back and that little tiny dollar size one too. Yeah, there was even one big gigantic conning tower where Ken blew away one of the big towers, and in a very clever way he projected that explosion onto a piece of foam core. I remember it was just a brilliant way of doing it.
And they also figured out they would throw like acetone on steel wool as well.
Oh, yeah.
And like that. And then that would they shot it under cranked and that would all burn. It looked great.
Yeah. Yeah, steel wool, it was flammable.
And then you had the big collapsing walker that weighed 200 pounds or whatever it was. And that's all stuff. I don't know who the guys were that built it. I know Richard shot it, and I've seen everybody setting it up, and explosion in it, and the thing would just fall down on its butt, then collapse or fall over, whatever. That thing was massive.
Originally, it was somebody would design this thing or propose that they have these electrical magnetic things that would hold the legs in position until you guys wanted to do the shot, and then they could control the way it dropped, and it didn't work. So I think Ted just worked up a cable coming out the top of the thing and had a little dent that broke the cable at the right time. But it just that's why sometimes it collapsed really good and sometimes it did not collapse very good.
There's also, if you notice, on the foot, the far camera right foot, there's a little rod that comes up.
Yeah.
And pushes it over.
Yeah.
My eye went right to that rod because I remember that rod. Can't they paint that out? Come on, guys. If you can add some buildings to Cloud City, you can paint out that rod. That bothers me.
It's part of the charm.
Yeah.
Ed Hirsch underneath the parallel.
Probably was Ed Hirsch.
And Joe, you had a little cameo in the film.
I did, and everybody who wanted to do that scene did the audition, and I wish I had Yi Zhao Young's audition because he just screamed the line. It was hilarious. You remember that, Lorne?
Yeah.
He just we watched them all in dailies, and he screamed the line at whoever he was supposed to be talking to. It was fantastic. I was sort of wishing he'd gotten the part.
Yeah, he was such an outrageous character. Tease was. I've reminded him of some of the things he said, and he says, "Oh, I don't remember any of that." And I thought, how in the world could he possibly forget that he did that? Or that he would say that? And he was really a character.
It was a different time.
We had a lot of fun and blew off a lot of steam. I was George asked me to come up with a way of doing that when Han Solo was melting out of the carbonite thing, and as part of that gag, I took there was a face casting of Han Solo that I needed, and I puppeted it so when everything like burned away, his mouth would open and he would take a breath. And I think at Christmas we made a bunch of videos, and I did a lip sync of Han Solo's face singing to Maurice Chevalier's "Thank Heavens for Little Girls." It was really classic.
We should talk about the map department, too. Harrison Ellisher came up to sort of head up the map department. And we found a couple of local guys, Craig Barron, and I forget a few other people, and some map painters, too. And they were all sort of in the back of the building, way in the back there.
Chris Evans and Frank Ordaz.
Right. Was Frank on that show?
I think he was, wasn't he? Or was he Jedi?
I think he may have been later. But it was at least Chris.
Craig was the manager.
And
Craig
Mike
was
there,
painter.
Pangrazio.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah.
And Ralph did a bunch of the Cloud City paintings, too. Map paintings.
Yeah, he did.
I think they preferred being upstairs, way in the back by themselves. That's the way I remember it. That they like to be pretty autonomous.
Yeah, where Mike could study law on his lunch breaks, not be disturbed.
Oh, just one more question that I had that we didn't go over. Kind of the interface between what was happening in production over in London on the stages and ILM. I know that for some things they would take the lead, they would build a set, and then Lorne, you would build a miniature of it. And then there were other times like the probe droid where the model shop, you guys would build something, send it over, and then they would build a bigger version of it for the production.
Right. Gary came to us one time because we weren't getting to the probe droid, and he had a couple of times said, you got to start the probe droid, you got to start the probe droid, because they need to build it in England. And so then eventually threatened us. He said, if you can't get it done in the next 2 weeks, we're going to have England start first. And that really put the fire to us. We didn't want that to happen at all. Trying to make something miniature from something that's been made big is really tough.
Right. To
find all those little parts. So I really, Paul and I just worked like crazy to get that little probe droid. We just switched totally what we were doing.
And then it was on them to build the big Anzio Annie parts.
Yeah. But they did a beautiful job of it.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
Yeah, it's easier to blow something up than to shrink it down.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, they were able to run off to old aircraft surplus places and find all those little parts for the side of the Millennium Falcon. And we would have been searching through kits and trying to make little things. It would be really tough.
Yeah. And that shot of that lifting up out of the snow and coming through the smoke and everything, that tight shot, that was similar to the Walker sequence, all done on camera, except not stop motion, little on the slow motion side. That was a nice little set.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys so much for this chat. I'm sure a lot of people are going to find it very enjoyable and educational. I'd also like to thank O90 for their help putting together this virtual event. And I guess we'll sign off.
Okay. Sign off.
Great. Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, guys. Great seeing you.
Okay. Yeah.